Welcome to the Data Vault Friday. My name is Michael Olschimke. I'm the CEO of Scalefree. We run this session here every Friday, essentially, to allow you, the audience, to ask questions. So you can ask any questions about Data Vault, big data, cloud computing, anything data-driven, at least, right? You can use the chat here in the client to ask live questions. You can use the Q&A section in the client, or you can just raise your hand if you want to ask something by voice, right? And I will show you after today's session a link to a form that you can also use to essentially type in questions, upload some, let's say, photographs of your whiteboard, maybe some images of a model that you want to send in. And if you receive multiple questions, I would cherry pick depending on some topic essentially, and it's time boxed roughly 10-15 minutes for every answer essentially. And then if there would be no questions at all, we will talk about the cluster here. But it's a longer story, so we did once in a while and captured it, especially over the summer break. So having said that, I have one question here, and that's essentially from me. And some of you know that, let me just share my screen here. Okay, people are leaving already, but no, it's okay. So, one of my favorite topics in Data Vault is essentially managed self-service BI. Why? Because it gives power users, business users, the control over the enterprise data warehouse. So in the extreme case, it means essentially that we, the data warehouse people, we will essentially deliver what we have to deliver to the business user where they struggle with. And that's essentially the infrastructure, the tools, storage and so on, the tools, and then also the integrated raw data. So everything from the data lake, the staging area maybe, into the raw data vault, that must be delivered from us. Well, from our perspective, we can automate that stuff, right? So there's automation tools you can use for automating the job to get the data from the source all the way through the data lake into your raw data vault. It's all pattern-based and so on. So for us, it's relatively easy. The challenge for us starts with the business vault, where we have to interpret the business logic from the user, apply it to the raw data, cleanse the data, transform the data, and so on. And that's where the challenges typically start for us, at least for me. So on the other hand, the business user, while they struggle with loading the data lake or with loading a raw data vault because they don't have maybe not enough scripting skills and so on, they are relatively comfortable applying business logic to the raw data because they know the data, they understand the business better than us, and they understand the business logic. So that's where they have a much easier time. And that's the idea now for managed services BI, at least in the extreme case, that we only deliver data until the raw data vault, and then the business side, the power users from the business side, they will pick up the data from us in the raw data vault, apply business logic in some form, maybe business vault, or, well, typically they do this in the user space, but then they apply the business logic to the raw data and produce the targets. That's the basic idea. In reality, we will produce standard reports. So there will be some, let's say, standard reports where we build the business logic for, because it's widely used and so on. And those reports we will produce. But there's so many reports where we don't have the time for because we don't have resources. And by that, I don't mean money, maybe. It's really about the human resource. We don't have enough qualified people in the industry to get all the jobs done which are required by the business users. That's what the state is. There's a lack of resources. And so no matter how much money you take in your hands, I love it, we're in consulting, that's on a point, but it doesn't help you, that's the point, right? So because you won't find a qualified resource. We will find certainly people who will take the money, that's not the point. So, and that's the problem. So we leave it essentially to the end user, to the business user, to build some of these reports on their own, where they either have no budget for that, or where we can't find resources for that to implement that, and so on, because we are limited. The idea of managed service BI is that they do this in the user space. So every power user gets their own user space, essentially. Some schema in Oracle, some database, maybe some key on the data lake for the unstructured or semi-structured user spaces. And they start building their own solutions. But then we discussed in one of our previous sessions, there's a process called the industrialization. So we typically monitor these user spaces. And then when we identify that a user is done with the business logic, we could then essentially industrialize the solution to turn it into a standard solution. Turn all the, let's say, I mean, in the end, they should build business logic in a form of business vault. So you would expect compute satellites in user space and exploration links and so on. But in reality, they just build it, right? So some way or the other. And during the industrialization, your job is to turn this into a standard solution using business vaults, using information marts, standard reports, and so on. That's the basic idea. And we said we're monitoring the user spaces, but what about monitoring? What do we monitor typically in these settings? Well, first of all, there's different approaches or applications when you how you could use the user space here, or why you would use the user space. One is because you have limited resources. The other one is for prototyping, for example, when users don't know yet how the business logic should look like. They want to see the data first, and based on the data, they can give you the business logic essentially. So it's a bit of it's a bit more agile, let's say. So what we do is we provide them the raw data in the raw data vault, and then they can essentially build the business logic on by themselves. And once they know what to do with the data, how to turn it into useful information, then we take it over. Well, this case you can identify based on the changes to the structures in the user space, which means that if they don't create new tables, create new views, or alter tables, alter views, or also drop tables, drop views on the structure, you know the solution has been became stable. And that's when you want to take a look at the user space. So one of the reports we typically create, or that we want to achieve, is how often do they modify the structures? Because really, when a user space not being modified anymore, you know it became stable, and then that's when you want to take a look at it. So that's one of the reports typically. And typically, in order to monitor these user spaces, you need a data warehouse, to be honest, right? And in Data Vault, that's really what we call the metrics vault. It's also in the book and in the training to some extent. The metrics vault is essentially a data vault model, a raw data vault model, next to the raw data vault essentially, but it captures the data, the runtime data of the data warehouse. All the log files from an ETL tool, source systems might include the ETL tools, the log files, but also system tables from your database system, runtime data from your nodes, and so on. It could be from the cloud backend, from the infrastructure, some let's say CloudWatch data, for example, and so on. So the metrics vault is a data vault model. You would expect, because looking at a lot of log files, you would expect a lot of non-historized links in this metrics vault, because log files are capturing events, and events are typically modeled as non-historized links. The hubs in the metrics vault are the hubs that define include the business keys that define our business, and our business is essentially defined by something like table name, schema name, username, maybe some identifier for business logic, and so on. Those are the business keys we are dealing with in our profession here, right? And those are the business keys you would expect hubs for in the metrics vault, because you're integrating all these log files based on those hubs essentially. And then there's a concept called the metrics mart. So in the end, it's eat your own dog food. If you ask your users to use, let's say, Tableau or Power BI, why don't you use it by yourself, right? For monitoring your data warehouse. So which means that if you have let's say, Power BI in place, Power BI doesn't really know what data vault is. So you want to turn it into a star schema, right? So, and that's where the metrics mart comes into play. So you have this metrics vault or data vault analysis, hubs and satellites, lots of non-historized links. And then you turn this into a star schema for the consumption by Power BI, Tableau, anything else. And the metrics mart is just an information mart. It's used for monitoring your system, your data warehouse. And yeah, there might be a gap between what you would need for the information delivery for monitoring your enterprise data warehouse and the raw data you receive from the source systems. So you might also consider a business vault in between, right? Typically as part of the metrics vault. So that's the first thing. So you might want to have some infrastructure, some small site data warehouse to monitor your data warehouse. The quick, I mean, this is a full-fledged solution, right? The quicker solution would be to to use some infrastructure that you have already from the cloud provider. Let's say, for example, internally, we use CloudWatch, for example, for monitoring most of the data. So internally, we don't use a metrics vault. I couldn't show you one at the moment, except from the infrastructure from the provider, which is so far sufficient for us so far, right? But it might change in the future, and then we have to go for a metrics vault essentially. Now, you need your so that's the monitoring infrastructure, and then all the data sources you need to build your business value for you now. Let's say you want to find out how often they change the user space, like creating new tables, altering these tables, dropping these tables. Well, there are system tables from your database that you can get the data from, and which is essentially metadata from the information schema. And that is like a full load. So when you realize that there's a change, let's say on the create table statement or create view statement, you know there's been some modification. So we do a delta check on this data, right? Just using a satellite delta in the metrics vault. Once you identify delta based on the script, then you know there was a change. When you realize that a table has been dropped because it's missing from the next load, right? You know there will be an effectivity satellite in your metrics vault where you can identify a dropped entity essentially, and so on. So it's quite straightforward essentially. And yeah, and once you have this data in the metrics vault, you can use it later on in the information in the metrics mart to essentially create a dashboard where you define some threshold. So maybe how long what was the duration? Well, the time frame when there was no change anymore. And then after 3 months, after months, whatever you define, I take a look at it. For example, when there was no change within the last 30 days, let's take a look at the user space and see if it's worthwhile to industrialize. You could have other business rules. You could say, well, if a user, because these users with the user spaces, these power users, they will build their solutions, but not only for them. They will also share it with other people. They might grant access to some colleagues, team members, maybe some to the managers. And typically, these solutions in the user space is for a limited audience. So once the impact gets too large on the organization, then you want to take a look at the solution for industrialization. So it should only be used by a few users, essentially. That's the idea by the team, for example. So it could be the number of people. Let's say the solution started out with 5 people using it, and then it became larger over time, and now it's 50 and 500. When do you put your threshold, right? So define your dashboard, define your threshold. Once a solution exceeds the threshold, you have to step in and see what's going on. Why is this solution used by 500 people, even though it should be only used by 5, right? It seems to be an important solution. So maybe it helps you, for example, so what we typically do is we define these thresholds, yes, but we typically prioritize the solutions, the user space solutions, by some KPI. And in most projects, most clients, they have a budget for industrialization, and they go by priority essentially. So the more users are using a solution, the higher your priority is essentially. Or you could define the level of user, because let's say once the CFO, the CEO starts using the solution, even if it's only 1 user, the impact on the organization is relatively high, right? So you want to take a look at that one as well. So that's a typical KPI users apply. Then you could take a look at a storage size and computing power. The more storage, well, typically there's a limit on how much storage a user can consume in the user space. And once they hit the limit, they come back to you. And that's when you want to take a look at what they're building and help them maybe with virtualizations and to optimize it a bit. But also same for computing power. I remember one client where they were using, the business user wanted to use Tableau data prep. So the Dataverse team came to me and said, well, is that a good idea? Should we allow it to them? And I said, yes, why not? Just allow it to them to use any tool they want, more or less, but then only if you can monitor the tool. So if you can monitor the infrastructure for Tableau data prep, for example. And once you see that solutions are consuming too much computing power, you want to, again, prioritize these data prep solutions by consumed resources. If jobs take too long to run, if they consume too much storage, too much CPU, those are the jobs you want to industrialize first. And the only thing they did is they essentially asked the business user to limit their data prep operations to the ones they could transfer easily to a database. Essentially, that was the idea. So not using Einstein and so on from data prep, but that was the idea essentially. And but then they had to monitor the Tableau server also as a data source into the metrics vault and see and essentially use a report on that. So yeah, without monitoring, you can't do an industrialization, to be honest. You can't prioritize in a larger setting. That's number one. So, and managed services BI is not just giving your users a user space or something, right? So it's really more than that. You want to monitor these solutions in order to industrialize them. And that's why monitoring is so important. One side note on that one. So we monitor everything on the user space, essentially storage, CPU consumption, the last drop, create or alter statement, and anything else that's relevant for your threshold, essentially, right? Which also means you're monitoring your power users a lot, right? Because everything they do in the user space will be monitored. And at least in Germany, but also in other countries, where you have a relatively powerful labor union, you want to talk to your Betriebsrat first, like the labor union representative reps in your organization. You want to talk to them because there should be something in place, like a user agreement, like they have to accept that they're getting monitored. And for what reason, right? So you have to convince the labor union that this is all good. It's not for monitoring productivity. It's really for monitoring the use of resources in the user space, and then for the industrialization process. So, but talk to them first, involve them early on, because if they will find out after you build everything, that's never good, right? So then they're getting let's say it looks suspicious to them. So I would involve them early on. That's what essentially we recommend to our clients. Just make sure you have them on your side. They can give you the inputs, what you should essentially how you should limit the monitoring to some extent as well, or any other guidelines you have to follow, right? So there might be some other organization guidelines, because you're really monitoring users. That's a problem. You're monitoring everything they do, loading data into the user space, consuming it, applying business logic, anything else. So yeah, that's the point. So all right, so you really involve some people. Cool. So that's why monitoring is important. Without monitoring, you can't industrialize, and industrialization is a key part of managed services BI. All right. If you have a question like this, and based on the style, you know it's a made-up question because I like the topic and I want to talk about it, right? So, yeah, so that's how you identify it. So, yeah, first of all, again, the Data Dreamland Conference 2022, that's essentially all about data-driven business value. Again, we love this business value-driven stuff, right? So it's on site in Germany, in Hanover. Oops, sorry, shouldn't have clicked this one. From September 13 to September 14, 2 days of, it's essentially one track, but 2 days of excellent speakers. So check it out. Check out the website if you can make it over to Hanover. We already organized some quite fun events in the night. So it's a yeah, packed 2 days of content, fun activities. I will be there. Most of the Scalefree team will be there, except those who really have to work with the client. But it's yeah, I'm looking for not only me, but everyone at Scalefree at the moment. So we're really looking forward for this meeting. So check it out. Try to come over and meet the team essentially. Okay, cool. So if you have a question like this that you want to discuss, we just changed the form. So when you go for sfr.ee/dbfriday, there is no Google form in the back anymore. There's a form that should be available to everyone. So if you ever experience some issues with the form in the background, couldn't sign in, that kind of stuff, it will work. And you can, again, upload some pictures from the whiteboard, maybe a team picture. Everything you upload might be presented here, right? So be aware of that. And yeah, submit your questions. Summer break is over, guys. Get ready back to work, right? Or back to work day. So yeah, you should have questions again. And yeah, hope you enjoyed the session today. Hope you come back next Friday. But I wish you a good weekend for today. Thank you. See you guys next Friday. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining today. If you'd like to discuss this further, give us a call on the number below here, and we're happy to discuss this with you. See you next time. Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.